Welcome to Watercolours with Caroline. This is week 5. We're going to be painting a scene from Chile, photographed by my friend Daphne Hatts when she was there on holiday this year. It's of the Atacama Desert at sunset and a beautiful photograph that she took. So another sunset for us, and let's do it in a long format. I did it on 4x8 paper. You can do it on 5x10. Any size you like really, but the long format looks best. So let's get our paints ready and we'll start painting. So our painting today is going to be taken from the Atacama Desert in Chile. My friend Daphne Hatts went there on holiday and took this beautiful photo amongst many of her beautiful photos and gave me permission to use it. So what I find very helpful when I do a painting is I insert the photo into a document and then I size it to the same size as my painting, if that's doable, if I'm doing a small painting. And that really helps me to have a reference photo right by my side that has the correct proportions and the sort of correct colors. You can color correct the photos before you put them in if you like, or even when you print them, the printer has a color correction option. So this is the photo printed just on ordinary copy paper. And I've done two versions here. I've done one with mixed dark colors, which I prefer. And then I've done one with black paint, which I don't like as much. I find black paint very dense and not very colorful, and you can't mix very nice muted colors with it. But some people like to use it for a silhouette. So I want to give you that option. I'm going to demonstrate the one with the mixed blacks, but you always have that option of using a Payne's gray or a black or some kind of dark paint if you prefer, if you don't want to mix the colors. Now I did mine on some paper I picked up at the art store just to try it out. It's a Fabriano pad of paper. I bought it because it was only $5.95. There were 30 sheets and they are very firmly glued together at the top and they're nice and flat. And they are just a student grade paper, but I didn't get bad results using it. I was fairly happy. It does have a bit of a texture. And of course, you can't do too much wet in wet on pulp paper. It does claim it's pulp paper, a lot of reclaimed pulp. But today for our demonstration, I've used my 140-pound Arches paper. Now we are going to do some color mixing exercises like we usually do. We're going to do mixing blacks and mixing dark colors, but I want to put the sunset colors on first so that we can leave them to settle in and dry a little bit before we move on to do all the dark colors, because we really need the sunset colors perfectly dry before we start putting in the mountains and so forth. So that'll be a nice little break. We'll do some mixing and then a little bit of hair dryer maybe and come back to the background. Now we've done sunsets before in, I think it was week 1 way back. So we've had some practice. And if you're starting a sky that has lots of blending, you really want to start with wet paper, or at least your sky wet. So I'm using my number 10 brush. And remember, you use a big brush, but for a small piece of paper, you don't need a giant brush. It's going to put too much water on, but you need a big enough brush that you can really wet the paper fairly quickly. Because if you take too long to wet the paper, it starts to dry before you get to the end of what you're doing. And that's no good, because if you've taken 10 minutes to wet your paper and it's starting to dry, you can't get your sunset colors on. So there we go. I've got to look at it from all directions, make sure it's perfectly wet. We're going to do the whole thing, the reflection and sky, all in one big go. And I'm checking it. It looks wet. So I'm going to switch to my number 8 brush for the first color I'm putting on, which is going to be my Azo Yellow. You might have Cadmium Yellow. You might have Transparent Yellow. They're all really good yellows. So here's my Azo. I just happen to like this one. You know me. Right. So I'm going to put that. I need to put that in the sky, very close to the mountains. And in the reflection in the, I believe, I wasn't there, but it looks like a lake. It looks like there's a lake there. So I must ask Daphne next time I talk to her. A little hair, my paint. Now, when I streak in the other colors, such as some pinks and reds and different ones, I want my brush strokes to be a little bit more controlled. So I'm going to switch to my number 6 or 4 brush. I'm switching to the 6 for a moment. And I want to put in some either pink or some red. You can put in whatever you like. If you put in a little bit of red, and I'll go with my cadmium red. I still love my cadmium red. It's Winsor & Newton, and it just does a good job. And I want to put a little bit of orange where those mountains are. Sort of, if I put the red on the yellow, I'll get a little bit of orange and across here. And of course, this in her photograph, there's lots of streaks in the sky. And they're actually quite a browny red, but I don't want to go that browny sort of color. I want to keep it nice and vibrant. So put a little bit down here. And pretty quick, I want to switch to the rose. If I put some of this nice red where the mountains are, I'm going to get that glowing through my darks. So I can put that there. If I wanted to, and I certainly might try it. I don't think I did it with the other one. I could, so that I have some orange glowing through these, I could put some cadmium orange actually where the mountains are, so that when I put the darks on, I will have some of that orange glowing through. What I don't want to lose, I don't want to lose too much of the yellow. I want to have quite a bit of yellow in the painting because her photo had quite a bit of very bright yellow in it. But now, because I'm going to put some lilac and some blue on, I have to buffer that with my rose. So I like permanent rose. It's a beautiful, cool rose color. Mine is Winsor & Newton. And I think I'll switch to my number 4 brush. And I want to get even more controlled, even smaller. And I have my rose paint. And that's going to go in above, not on top of the yellow, above the yellow, because it's going to melt into some lilac and some blue. I certainly want a little bit in the water here, the reflection. I'm using a little bit of water in my brush to even it out. The photograph has a little bit of blue here. Of course, I won't put that in at this stage, but I might put that in later. So I'll add a little bit of rose here. I want to keep this fairly light because I'm going to have some nice light reflections there. Now, this is all going to be dark down here. So that's where I can put the lilac. And I'm going to mix a lilac. I'm going to mix rose and cobalt blue. You can mix rose and ultramarine blue if you like. It's totally up to you. It will give you a lovely violet, and I'm going to put that in. Although her picture didn't have any violet in, I really like it next to the rose, and I'm taking a bit of an artistic liberty with the photo because I just think the violet looks so pretty against the rose. And I will put a little bit of ultramarine blue for the night sky. I'm just getting some ultramarine blue on my brush. I just still got my number 4 brush because there's not much ultramarine blue. I'm just going to put in a little bit near the top of the sky here. I'm sweeping it. See how I'm sweeping? I'm going from outside the tape and sweeping it so that, and then as I come to the end of that sweep, I lift my brush so that I don't get a blob sort of shape. I get more of a cloud drifting in type of shape. And it's really important how you use your brush strokes and your brush. Now down here is going to be shaded with dark. It's a silhouette. So I'm going to put the ultramarine blue down here. Of course, if the ultramarine blue mixes with the rose, it will just make a violet. That's why I say we buffer it with the rose so that if we have any blue mixing or any violet mixing, we're not going to get gray or brown. If the violet mixes with the yellow, we'll get brown or gray. And if the blue mixes with the yellow, we'll get sort of green. So we want to keep our sky much more vibrant than that. Now, this is a stage where you must stop. Do not keep on going with more streaks and more water or more anything, because if you put more water in, you're going to get those cauliflower blooms. If you put more paint in, you're going to overdo it at this stage. You can always put more in after it's dry if you feel you need it. And if you go painting at this stage, I can see it's drying right here. You're going to get all kinds of horrible things happening where your wet paint meets the dry paint and they fight. Right now, I really like what's happening up here. I've got a lovely flowing of the blue and the violet colors coming down into the yellow. And they're not making a bad color. They're just drifting down, which looks really pretty. So I want to stop and put this to one side, knowing that I can add a little bit more color later if I need to, but I can't very easily take it off. So let's put this to one side to settle in, and I will use the hairdryer. And now let's work on mixing darks, because that's a real skill. You can buy gray paint, you can buy black paint and use them, and that's fine. Like I said, that's your choice, but learning to mix darks is a really good skill, because you don't need many paints to get a lovely variety of grays and blacks and dark colors. So I will get my bigger brush so that I can get my number 8 brush. I'm going to mix quickly and easily. And the one we're going to use in this painting first is the Cadmium Red and Azo Yellow, which of course will make a nice orange. And then we're going to darken it down with the Ultramarine Blue. So it's our 3 primary colors, basically red, yellow, and blue. That's the sort of formula you need to use for mixing a dark color or a gray or a black. So I'm going to start with my yellow. It's always a good place to start, the light one. I've got a little bit of red still there and some cadmium red until we get a nice orange. And then I'm going to add my ultramarine blue. And it may not be dark enough to start with, so I might have to go back and forth, mixing a bit of this, a bit of that. So what we've got is a sort of a lovely gray color, which is not going to be quite dark enough for what we want. I'll pop it there just to see what it looks like. So I'm going to add a little bit more yellow, a little bit more red, not too much water. And I'm not cleaning my brush in between. That's why I start with yellow, because I don't want to dilute this. I want it nice and strong. You just have to come back and clean up your paints later. And that's why if you start with your yellow, you should start fairly clean. I'm going heavy on the blue. And then I'm going to try this out. And see, there's a big difference between the first one where I had maybe a bit too much water. I was just starting out. And now this one where I have less water and a bit more blue. I'm going to add a bit more red to that. I am washing my brush now and using my trusty sponge to just, I'm going to clean one for you this week. The other one looks so grungy, but it's only grungy with paint. I'm going to get a little bit of red and add that in and make a much warmer color and test that here. So I've got a warm sort of brown color. And that is actually what I want in those background mountains. They transition from sort of an orangey brown over to a much sort of darker blue brown. A little bit yellow. I want to keep going with this until I get some different mixes. And that's a much warmer brown. That might be good for the middle of the mountains. And now I'm going to add some more blue in there. Now this is going to be a dark color that will be easy to lift. All these colors are easy to lift. Ultramarine blue is a good one for lifting. So if you put them in too dark and you wanted to lift them out, this is a good mix to use. If you are nervous and you don't want something that stains, or you maybe want to manipulate it or do wet in wet, this is a really great mixture. Look at the whole variety I've got here just with a few mixes. And of course, if you use a thirsty brush, I'm just making my brush thirsty, which means cleaning it, drying it, get my towel. And then I'm going to show you how you can use a thirsty brush on this one. You can pull through the paint with your thirsty brush And because these colors are not particularly staining colors, look, I can get almost completely back to the white paper. So I don't have to be nervous about using these colors. And if I wanted to paint a tree trunk or a rock or something with these colors, I can put it on dense like this, and then I can start lifting out my highlight areas. You'll see this one's granulating because ultramarine blue is a great granulating pigment. And sometimes that is a beautiful look for a rock or something like that. Now, if we want to make this even darker and more intense, adding some phthalo blue to the mix and even some permanent rose, a cool red and a warm red, is going to change it up again. So I will clean up that spot. I think I'll use my old grungy sponge for cleaning up that spot. And let's try it again without the yellow this time. So we're going to have some, I'm going to start with the reds so I don't make them too dirty. I'm going to have some cadmium red, a warm red, and some permanent rose, a cool red. We have a good mix there for our red, yellow, blue. We don't have any yellow in this one, but we'll see how it is. We're going to have some ultramarine blue. It may be more like a dark gray. Now, so far, this won't stain too badly, but once we put the phthalo blue in, we have a mix that might stain. So if we're confident that this is what we want, and it's going to be okay. A bit more rose. Now we're going to get a very violet color with this. Of course, the cadmium red is your more warmy red, and we'll put that in. So we can only really mix a violet with that. Of course, if we add the yellow, we're going to change that. It will change it to it will be a more browny color. See the difference? I just added a bit of yellow to that and it changed it up to a much more browny color. I'll add a little bit more. Hang on, a little bit more phthalo blue. A little bit, there we go. A little bit more phthalo blue, a little bit more rose. And I'm just adding a little bit more of other colors, a bit more cadmium red. Now my red's very dirty. A bit more cadmium red, have a slightly warmer one. And then again, I'll go with a little bit more phthalo blue. We have some very dark blues and dark purples. And by adding the yellow, we get more of a gray. Again, I'll clean that up. Next one, I've got ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. That's one of my favorite mixes. And we can also try it with sepia. Now, if you don't have a sepia, you can use burnt umber or you can use Van Dyke brown, basically any sort of a dark brown. I just happen to like sepia. That's the one I like. But I really do love ultramarine blue with burnt sienna. It's my favorite gray to mix. So I'll start with my blue. So my blue is an M. Graham blue and my burnt sienna is a Winsor Newton. And this is one of your most versatile dark colors. You can mix dark brown, you can mix a dark gray. This is sort of 50-50 ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And then I'll add a bit more burnt sienna to make it more of a dark brown sort of a color. So really, you don't really need to buy a sepia or dark brown. It's just sometimes more convenient to have it there. And I just bought one for convenience because you can mix something almost a little bit more, almost the same as a sepia or a burnt umber just by putting ultramarine blue with the color. But I'm going to try it now with the sepia. It just means you can go dark maybe a bit quicker and with less mixing than if you do it with the burnt sienna. And you can go almost black, actually. This, actually, ultramarine blue with the sepia is almost, I'm going to do a Payne's grey beside it. Sorry. Yes, ultramarine blue with the sepia. I'm going to do a Payne's grey beside it so you can see how they compare, because my Payne's grey has a lot of ultramarine blue in it. So it is a little bit more blue. But if you put a little bit more blue in the mix, you could have your own Payne's grey by mixing a sepia or a burnt umber with your ultramarine blue. The next one is phthalo blue, burnt sienna, and permanent rose. So I'll start with my burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is a lovely, lovely color for mixing. It's a very orangey brown, so you can use it in place of the red and yellow for mixing lovely, lovely dark colors. Then we want phthalo blue with that. Phthalo blue, again, a staining color, pretty intense, so you have to be careful with it. And a little bit of permanent rose to warm that up, just to make it, there we go, a warmer color. I'm going to do it with a bit more permanent rose just to warm it up a little bit more. Whatever ratio you use is going to change. Your dark. A bit more permanent rose. It almost goes violet now because rose and phthalo blue make a lovely violet. And then I'll do it with a lot more burnt sienna, so it's a more of a dark brown. So here it is with a lot more burnt sienna. So it's more of a dark brown, much more like your sepia or your burnt umber. So it's saves you money if you don't want to buy all the colors. You can mix a huge variety just with 6 or 7 colors. You don't need a big paint box full. I buy them to experiment. I buy them because I love buying paint, but I know I don't need them. So the other one I got is phthalo blue and sepia and cadmium red. So this should make a nice dark mix. The phthalo blue is staining. The sepia stains a little bit, and the cadmium red like an orange. We pop that here. It makes a really, really dark color. I'm going to add a little bit more blue to that. So it's a more bluey, too much blue probably. And too much water. As soon as you add more water to your color, it's going to be lighter. I'll demonstrate that by adding more water to that color I just mixed and painting it here. You could do the same. You could use your color full strength, or you could dilute it down to a nice light gray. Great if you're doing a road in a picture and you want your road to go from like a light gray color where it's in the sunlight to a dark color in the shadow. You use the same color basically. You just add more water for your light layer. If your road's in the sunshine, sometimes just adding a little bit of yellow to your mix gives it a slight warmth, or a little bit of rose or red just to warm up your tarmac in the sunlight. So the next one is phthalo blue, ultramarine blue, and burnt sienna. You'll notice that we're using pretty much repeats of the colors because they are all excellent colors for mixing black or for mixing gray. And the paint manufacturers know that, so that's what they use a lot of the time. Burnt sienna, there we go. I'm not going to show you my paint box the whole time because it's awkward for me to keep bringing it over here. That's a really lovely dark color. I'm going to just lighten it down with a little bit of water and lighten it down again with a little bit of water. Same color. I've not mixed anything else in it. The only thing I've mixed into it is water, and we can take it down to a nice light gray. Has a slight greeny tinge. It doesn't have much in the way of warm colors in it. Doesn't have any yellow in it or red, but the burnt sienna gives it a sort of an orange. So it has a greeny tinge. If you wanted to offset that greeny tinge, I'm just going to add a little bit of cadmium red in there and pop that there so I could make it a warmer gray if I needed to. If I didn't want it so green, I think I really like them and mixing together wet in wet, making a rather beautiful color there. And sometimes your most beautiful colors are the ones that are really diluted, very wet in wet, and they all mingle together on the paper. And it's so hard to get that effect unless you really use a lot of water and a variety of paints. So next one is ultramarine blue and cadmium orange. It's just your regular complementary colors, as basic as you can get. I'm running low on ultramarine blue. I certainly use a lot of that color. And cadmium orange. We won't get a very, a little bit more orange maybe. We won't get a very dark color with those two. They won't give us anything particularly dark, but it is quite nice for greenish color shadows. I'm adding a little bit more ultramarine blue. Or maybe a bit more ultramarine blue. And it's just grayed down with a little bit of the orange. If ever you find a color too bright, too intense, you just need to add a tiny little bit of its complementary to just what we call gray it down. Just take it down a little bit so it's not quite so bright. Now, phthalo green and alizarin crimson are a really interesting combination. They're not exactly a black or anything, but they just are a really interesting combination when mixed together. So here they are sort of 50-50. And of course, I got quite a bit of water with them. So let's get them a bit more intense. Let's get less water, more paint. There we go, a bit more intense. See, the more intense I go, less water, we get a much richer, darker color, less water again. Let's add a little bit more green. That's just two colors, two very nice transparent colors, phthalo green and alizarin crimson. Together they make some lovely, lovely dark colors. And you've got the transparency of the phthalo green. And the less colors you mix together dark, the less likely it is that you'll get mud. So I've got a couple, I mean, you can go on and on with this, trying out your triads of red, yellow, blue, and mixing colors, but I just got a few for today. Prussian blue plus sepia plus alizarin crimson. So Prussian blue is quite a dark blue. I just have to make sure I've got my Prussian. Yeah, there we go. The blues all look the same when they're dry. My indigo and my Prussian and my phthalo all look exactly the same. If I don't turn it around so I can see the labels, I'm not sure what I'm doing. Sepia. Now I try not to, if I'm using these dark colors, I try not to wash my brush because it does dilute them way too much. And alizarin crimson, I'm not even going to wash my brush for that alizarin. I can clean that up later. Oh, that is a really, really nice dark. Let's take that down with some water and see how it is as a light gray. Not quite so much water there. And quite a lot of water here. It's a very, very pretty gray. Very pretty. That's Prussian blue, sepia, and a little bit of alizarin crimson to warm it up. And the last one, we are going to use some Payne's gray and alizarin and some crimson and some Azo yellow to see what we get. Now, as you notice, all of these colors make a gray color. So Payne's gray is just a quick way to get a good gray, and it's lovely if it's mixed with other colors. I'm going to take some Payne's gray and mix it with some alizarin. Again, not cleaning my brush because I don't want it diluted. And I do want to clean it before I go in my yellow. See, that's why I should go in the yellow first, but I forget that so often. It's because I want to get it dark, and then I want to just modify it with a touch of yellow. And Payne's gray. This is going to make a kind of a nice browny gray, and I'm going to add a little bit more alizarin crimson, a little bit more Payne's gray. I'm just changing it up. A little bit more Payne's gray. And we've got quite a few different sort of browny black colors. Now just remember, all of these dark colors can be lightened by adding water to them to make some beautiful light grays and subtle colors and everything in between. And as they're drying, you can start to see the granulation that happens if you have ultramarine blue in your mix or burnt sienna. Ultramarine blue and burnt sienna are highly granulating colors if you've got a good mix of paint. And my cadmium red here is sort of it's all migrated to one side where it stayed a little bit wet. Of course, this is just a Canson student paper, so it doesn't absorb the water very much, and it's great for testing out like this, but it's not so good for wet in wet or using particularly wet washes. I really like this one where they've all kind of really separated out. I'm thinking if I was painting rocks, this would be a beautiful look, you know, rocks by the ocean where they're sort of salty and crusty. And so that's Phthalo Blue, Ultramarine Blue, and Burnt Sienna. I really love that look. It gives that greeny textured rock. I think I'm going to see, you can soon forget. I'm going to circle that so I don't forget that that's a really good mix. It's time to get back to our painting now. I have dried this with a hairdryer. It's perfectly dry, and I've made sure that my tape is pressed down. Remember, the hairdryer lifts it up, so you have to press it back down again. And the next part of this painting to work on is these background mountains back here. And it was harder on this cheap paper to get a good transition, but what I want is a transition from a sort of an orangey brown over here to a mid gray brown to a darker gray brown over here. And I'm deliberately being a bit more dramatic than the photo, although the real photo had more definition than this one. So I'm going to sort of have my Azo Yellow and Cadmium Red mix with just a touch of blue to make it a little bit darker over here. And then I'll mix a bit more blue, a bit more blue, and a bit more blue as I go across, keeping my paint fairly liquid so I don't get too much of a, I don't want it to stop in between the colors. I want the colors to blend nicely. And that was much harder to do on the cheap paper. So we need to keep this dry. We're not going to wet it. We need to mix up our mixes. So first of all, I want my Azo Yellow and my Cadmium Red, which is dirty with some blue now, which doesn't matter because I was going to dirty it up anyway to get it a little bit browner. So that's good for the ones in the left distance. I'm going to take the same mix, but I'm going to put a little bit of blue with it to make a browny sort of orange that's going to transition from this one to the next one. And then I'm going to mix another one up with more blue for the darker side as we come over to the, I'm going to add a bit more red to that, a bit more blue. I've got 3 mixes here. Hopefully they're going to work. And get my painting straight so you're not trying to put your head sideways to look at it. And I think I don't want a brush that's too small, or I'm not going to get enough paint on here, but I don't want one that's too big either. I'm going to start with my number 6 and see how that goes. And I need to get the orangey, browny orange color first. And remember, I've got some orange underneath, so that'll probably glow through. And the reason I want a fairly small brush is I want to get into these little areas without crossing over into some of the other rocks. But what I need to keep doing is dipping my brush in the paint. Otherwise, I'm not going to have wet paint going across here, so I won't get a lovely transition. So I get to about, I can go a little bit further than where I want the transition because I can pull the paint back. And if you want a nice straight line, get your brush like flat sideways and just pull the point of your brush, pull it along, but keep your wrist. All of this is resting on my paper. Now, wash my brush, dry it on I've got my little sponge here just to dry my brush a little bit. I'm going to get my mid color, my mid brown color, and start to use that. I'm going to add a little bit more ultramarine blue to it because I want that to mingle with the orange and run back into it a little bit. And then take some of that brown and pull that along. Now, if you don't keep your paint wet enough, you're not going to get it blending. It will have lines everywhere. You'll have a stop and start line. So you need to make sure that your brush is always, and I'm going to go into the blue, always like really loaded with wet paint. Remember to pull that line across the horizon there. If you have a very shaky hand and you can't get it straight, then put some masking tape there before you start this part. And the masking tape will keep your line straight. And I'm going into that dark blue color. I'm adding a little bit of water to my brush so that I keep the paint nice and liquid. So I can keep going across. And I'm going to do something interesting, different. And go back to the orange mix from the beginning. I'm going to put a little bit of that orange mix in there. So I have a bit of a mix coming up to the end here where I've got orange mixing with the dark blue gray mixture. Now it's the same three colors throughout, but back here it was the Azo Yellow and Cadmium Red with just a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of Ultramarine Blue. In the middle, it was the Azo Yellow and the Cadmium Red with a bit more Ultramarine Blue in it. And at the end here, where I'm painting now, it was mostly Ultramarine Blue, but still those are the two colors. And I want to make sure that I don't have that mountain going downwards as I come to the edge here. See, I'm pulling this at an upward angle. If I have that going at a downwards angle here, it's going to lead your eye out of the painting at the side. Just changing this angle to an angle that comes into the painting like this brings you into the painting instead. It's just a tiny thing, just a little tiny thing, but it's so important to your composition. Now, all of this paint is still wet, and that's how it should be if you're using your paint and your brush correctly. And while it's still wet, that means I can come back and I can do what's called charging. That's where if I want to put a little bit more dark on the mountain somewhere or add a little bit of definition, maybe I want some dark over here, I can just tip the brush to the wet paint and the dark color will charge in. That's a little bit too charged. So I'm just going to use the Thirsty brush, which is a wet, clean brush that's been dried off a little bit. And I'm going to just pull back a little bit of that charge. If I want to, I can mix up a little bit more orange. I want to get a little bit more orange in there. And a little bit more orange in here too, if I want it. So that I have those transitions. Now it's starting to dry. So once you see it starting to dry, you have to stop doing any of that manipulation. You can't do any more without getting backgrounds, cauliflower blooms, things happening that you don't really want to happen. But see, with those three colors and those three mixes, there's quite a transition across here. And what it's showing is the sun is somewhere, I believe, probably over here off the side of the painting or just below the horizon. And it's making this part glow. And then, of course, over here, it's much more in shade and we have a more silhouetted look. And we have all of the yellow here from the sunlight still. So it's really nice to have those transitions throughout just one mountain range rather than just have a silhouetted black mountain range. Imagine if you're just using black paint, you can't get that lovely transition that we have with this. Now, once we've done that one, we do not want to do this one because this one will then run into your orange and you'll lose your orange there. It will all get filled up with the dark color we're going to use here. So we need to leave that area. A great area to work on is this foreground dark area because it doesn't touch any wet paint. And we can put that in with a lovely dark color too. Now, on mine, I've gone with a more lilac-y color. So we need to mix up a very different color to this. And that's why I prefer to use color to black, because we can have all these different ones that we just practice with, so you practice mixing all these different colors. I want to use the more violet one in the front. So I'm going to use the Phthalo Blue and the Ultramarine Blue with some permanent rose, and we'll see what that gives us. I might want to add in a little bit of the yellow if I want to darken it up a little bit. We'll just see what we get. Bigger brush for mixing. And I'll start with the rose. I'll bring my palette over, get some of my permanent rose. Now, this is a good opportunity to clean up some of the paints. I got a bit messy with the blacks, because if I use a brush to take all the paint off that rose, it cleans it up quite quickly. And Phthalo Blue. So the phthalo is so strong, we get a very strong color almost immediately. And a little bit of ultramarine blue. And I think I'm going to take just a little bit of sepia just to brown that up a little bit. I may not have put that in my notes, but right now I think I'm just going to add a little bit of sepia to that, just to brown it up a little bit. We'll still see the violet sort of undertones. And that's actually I'm going to get a little bit more rose and a little bit more, you know, as soon as I put it on the paper, I make a different decision usually. There we go. And a little bit more water to that. I don't want it too thick. I want to be able to, and I'm using my number 10 brush because this is quite a big area that I'm painting in here. I want to get it in without, see, I don't go back. I just go forwards or sideways or onwards, whatever you'd like to say. But I don't want to go back over the paint and out to the side. Don't go back. I see people go back. They go back and they keep doing this. They keep stroking and they keep putting water and paint in. And what you do is you get big streaks, you get paint taken off, you get all kinds of things happening that just ruin the picture. Big brush, one wash, and leave it to dry. Just leave it. Don't fuss with it. And look at the drama between the sort of the violet dark and the orangey brown dark. Very different feel to it. And I get that brush nice and clean. And now I need to wait really until this is dry, or dry it, because I know the minute I do anything else, I'm going to get my wrist in this, because I'll be resting my wrist to do some of these areas, or I'll be trying not to rest my wrist, and it's not good for painting to not have a good firm rest while you're controlling the brush. And also I don't want to go to the hairdryer too quickly, because this needs to soak in and start to dry all by itself. But I'll give it a couple of minutes. I'll pause for you, and then I'll come back when it's dry. I have dried the whole painting now, so there's no danger of me getting my hand in anything and smudging paint, and it's very nice to work on a dry surface. So I want to put this dark rock in next, because it's over on the left and I'm less likely to smush that. And this is all perfectly dry, so I can come up against it. So this is a very purpley blue mix here. This is the orangey brown mix. Really want a very neutral mix in the middle. So you can use Payne's Gray, you can use some sepia, you can use anything to make this mix that we've used so far. I'm looking at my little chart here. My ultramarine blue and burnt sienna looks like a really nice mix for in here, and I might add a little bit of phthalo blue. We'll see. Let's try with the ultramarine blue and burnt sienna first. Maybe a little bit of the sepia too. I just want a very neutral sort of dark color for the middle. So I have some ultramarine blue and something here. It doesn't matter what, because we're going to mix them all together to make a gray. So I'm going to get some burnt sienna with that ultramarine blue and a little bit of sepia. and see what we get. And I think I'm going to add a little bit of, whenever I go into that phthalo blue, it's just so intense. It takes over everything. That's okay. We need some dark paint. So let's get some sepia in there and some burnt sienna to just warm it up a little bit. That's looking good. That's looking good and dark. Ooh, look how juicy and dark that looks. A little bit of water on my brush. I got my number 6 brush. I think, you know what, I think I'm going to switch to my number 4. This is quite a small little area. Remember, I'm working on 4-inch by 8-inch paper, so it's quite small. Much nicer working on the Arches paper than on that cheaper paper. But I did like that cheaper paper for the money and for outdoor painting. It's just lovely. But you do get a bit of a texture, and the wet in wet doesn't work as well. You can kind of see the difference between this one with the texture and not working wet in wet too well, and the Arches where you get a very even, flat wash. It's cold press Arches, so you don't see a lot of texture. Easier to paint on for sure. So now I've got this kind of neutral gray black for this silhouette here. And again, pull your brush, like get it, you kind of squash it down, not too far down because you want to control, but take it, rest your hand and pull to get that nice straight line. Keep your paint wet so that you don't get any lines where you stop and start and pick up paint. And don't go back. Once this part's done, it's done. You don't go back and paint over it. You don't keep stroking it. You're not painting a house or a wall. You're trying to get on a wash in one go with no brush stroke showing. No stop and start marks. And I'm having to use just the point of this little number 4 brush. That's why I switched, because I've got some very small detail coming up here. And also don't forget to dip in your paint. You have a puddle of paint over there for a reason. It's so you can load your brush frequently, so you're not trying to paint with an empty brush. Because again, that's going to show some brush strokes. So we've got that in. You may see with my close-up, you may see a little bit of wiggle on the bottom here. I can straighten that up. I promise you, although you can really see that, the close-up on the camera, in real life, even with my strong reading glasses on, you don't really see that too much. So I like that. I like that we've got this nice orangey brown, and then a very neutral blue-gray, and then a more violet sort of color in the foreground. The next thing to work on is the area over here on the, I've got to get that on the camera, sorry. The area over here on the right. Now see here, we've got some reflection in the water where the mountain reflection is broken up with this reflection. So we have to be very careful when we paint this, that we leave some of the color on there so we get that reflection look. So it's good to go in and do that before we kind of go over to the other side to put the rest of the more solid reflections in. So we're going to want a combination of colors. We want some of that neutral sort of blue, gray, dark color that we just mixed. And we want some of that brown color from the mountains as well. So we can go back and forth between the two. If you can see in the photograph, there's a sort of, at the edge of the mountains here, there's more of that orangey brown, and towards the horizon, there's more of a dark neutral color. And probably in the true photograph, there's even more variation, but it's a very small painting. We don't want to get too fussy with some of that stuff. So what I need to do now, I've got a lovely neutral mix. I need to go back and mix up some of that original mix that we had, which was the Azo Yellow and the Cadmium Red. So, and this is a good opportunity to clean my red. See, if I take a paintbrush and I just swirl it around in my red a bit, clean water, I'll just clean it up enough for next time. And the yellow, if I start with yellow, that keeps it pretty clean. And then I can get some ultramarine blue. It really doesn't matter. I've got a red and yellow on my paintbrushes. I dip it into the blue. The blue soon cleans up. And I need to mix up some of that browny sort of blue color. I might even add a little bit more red to that. You have to kind of go back and forth until you just get it how you want it. A bit more red, a bit more yellow, more red. Don't stop until you get what you want. It means a bit of back and forth sometimes. And it's annoying if you have to keep washing your brush because you keep diluting the mix, which I don't like doing, but I do want to try and not dirty up my yellow. All right, there. I think we got an orangey. Yes, I could even add in a little bit of burnt sienna if I wanted, because that's a very orangey brown and quite a good one. I'm going to add a little bit of that burnt sienna in. Now, I want a small brush, my number 4, because I want some control. And I'm going to keep it dry over here because I don't want to lose those highlights. And I'm going to start with the more gray color for close to these mountains. And I'm going to come in with that first. And as I come in on the dry paper, I can leave some of the dry paper showing. And then as I come across here, I can connect those lines. Now, this little part might still be a little bit wet, so I don't want to touch it yet. I'm going into that now. I'm going into that brownie mix that I mixed and taking that back into that gray mix. See where I stop here? I don't want to stop just with a bad line. I want to stop so that if I come and fill this in, it still looks okay. I'm going into the orangey brownie color. And what I really want to focus on over here is leaving all of this reflection showing. And remember, if I leave too much, I can go back in and fill it in later, but I don't want to cover up too much of it. There's quite a bit showing, and better to leave too much at this stage than not enough. Now, I also want to get the reflection of I've kind of put a few pencil lines in to guide me, going into that bluey gray. Keep your lines horizontal because that's how water is. And if you don't use horizontal lines, not going to look like reflections in water. I can promise you that. Now I want to get the top of this. See, I'm still using those horizontal lines to connect. I want to get the top of the mountain in, and it kind of peters out at the side here again with some reflections, using the point at the tip of my brush to slowly fill in that mountain. Now there are some darker reflections. I'm going into the brownie color, but I want to work on them very, very slowly. And I'm taking out my reference photo, and these are all that brownie color. I'm going to bring them in. I come in and then I come in and lift the brush so that it kind of peters off to a nice thin line. Sorry, when I'm working like this, I forget my language. I'm taking it back a little bit. Now I will come in with a bit more browny orange in a moment, just to blend it in, but I can't do that because I don't want to have a wet in wet thing going on here. These are too distinct for that. Now I'm going into that. I'm going to add a little bit more cadmium red into that brownie mix because these reflections here are much more orangey brown. So I'm going to add a little bit more cadmium red, a little bit more yellow. That's it. And I've got a much warmer color here to put in. And the reflections are quite sharp. So I'm not using any wet in wet or feathering or anything to take them back. I'm keeping them nice and sharp. And they have to reflect what's happening. I'm going to try and make sure I do that too. And this is dry enough now, and even if it wasn't, it would be okay to come up against it like this. I can come right up against that one, because even if it blended a little bit, that would still look like it was part of the reflection. The reflections get much darker as they come over to the left and move my painting over. So I'm going to go back into the bluey gray that we used for this little rock, and we have to reflect the mountains and the rock now. So I can take a bit of that color back into the wet orangey color so that they transition softly into each other. And as they come down over here, I'm going to switch up to my 6 brush because I need more paint on my brush as I come over here. It's both colors, and I'm dipping both colors. Come down here. That nice and dark. And what you want is you want the drama. You want the drama of the dark against the yellow. You don't want it to be wishy-washy. And take that across. Now on the photograph, there's also some very dark islands coming in here, which I'll put in when this bit has dried a little bit. And also behind here, there's no yellow showing on the photograph. So back to my number 2 brush. I want to really, really get in here with the dark. And adding a little bit of brown to my brush. And get in behind, whoops. Be careful that again that you've got your straight horizon line. Bring this back. And I will have a double layer of reflection here, but that is also happening in the photograph. There is a much darker layer at the base of the mountains here. Almost looks like there might be something else in front of those mountains that I just can't see in the photograph. But there is like 2 colors, 2 dark colors here. So I'm sort of blending them together so that we have dark really next to the horizon. And then the lighter brown at the top. Try and straighten that up. And a little bit more dark here, just a little bit more. Now, when this is dry, I want to go in and put a little bit more orangey color on the right for some of those reflections. But right now, I don't want to do that. It will mess up what I've got. And I want to try and keep all of these darks really clean and sharp and one layer. I don't want to make, when you're making these darks with 2 or 3 or even 4 colors, you can easily make mud if you have 2 layers of them. They get too opaque and too dense, but one layer is beautiful because quite often you can see the pink, you can sort of see the pink through this layer, which is a very pretty effect. Now we just have a few little islands to work on, and I want to use a combination of all these darks that I've used, sort of browny colors, and get my bigger brush to mix with. I definitely want some ultramarine blue in there and some burnt sienna because I just love those 2 as a mix. And a little bit, I have to be careful with that phthalo. It's so strong. A little bit of phthalo. Maybe a little bit of sepia. You see, I'm getting 4 or 5 colors now, so that's why I can only use one layer. A little bit of cadmium red to warm that up. a bit ultramarine blue. I'm making my red dirty again. A bit of phthalo. See, I'm going back and forth. Burnt sienna, a little bit of sepia. Going back and forth till I get a nice sort of warm, dark color. My number 2 brush, I'm going to be doing quite, well, actually I'll start with number 4. I'm going to be doing quite a bit of detail and start with that nice dark mix on my brush. Now, the first thing that's here is this. Actually, I'm going to add a little bit more red and a little bit more burnt sienna. I'm just going to warm that up a little bit. See, as soon as I put my brush on the paper, I kind of make a decision about what I need. And then from here, there's a little island coming in. I guess there's some sort of rocks, and I wasn't there. You have to be there to know what all this is. I'm just guessing. As long as we get it close enough, I think we're good. And it looks like these are rocks on the edge of the lake. I have had some amazing photographs sent to me by all of you from around the world where you've been on your holidays. My brother just sent me some from Iceland, and they're so beautiful. And it's lovely to have photographs that I'm allowed to paint because you've taken them, you've given me permission, and I really like that. So keep them coming if you have good photos. They're just so lovely. So there's a few. I'm looking back and forth to the photo reference. I want to try and get these islands so that they look natural. So important to look at your picture all the time. You can't paint from imagination, no matter what anybody says. If your imagination has lots of references in it, like if you've been a lot of places, if you're a good observer, if you've taken lots of photographs and your imagination is full of reference ideas, fine. You can then use all the reference material that you have in your imagination to paint from. But if you can't remember what things look like, or you're not really sure, you have to look at something. You can't just try and remember or make it up, because that's when the picture looks odd, because you're not remembering correctly or you're not using perspective correctly. And I can't paint unless I have a photo in front of me or a scene in front of me or something to look at. Now, these are all sort of little clumps of, looks like clumps of mud and grass, because I can see grass growing out the top. So I'm sort of just putting them in little tiny brush strokes. And they need to be sort of slightly different shapes. And I'm going to use my small brush in a minute to put even more detail in. There's one here. I'll use my little tiny brushes and my rigger brush to put in some grass and stuff. But for the moment, I can put the main shapes in. There's one sort of clump here. A little one that sort of sticks up here. All these just like little shapes, the elongated shape here, the clump shape here, a bit here. They're also important to getting the feel of the landscape so that it looks real. Even though we're doing a sort of an impressionistic look at the landscape, it still needs to kind of look real. I'm going to add a little bit more ultramarine blue to my mix to change it up a little bit as I get more blue over this side of the painting. I'm coming in with this, I think they're like mud flats over here. Bringing those in. And sometimes you do need to mix up a bit more paint or add a bit more blue. See, I want to have this side over on the left warmer and this side over on the right cooler. So that means I want to use a bit more blue in my mixes over on the right-hand side. But these are all like mud flats and rocks here. We'll bring those in. And there's quite a big clump here of rocks and mud, and it connects to a bigger clump here. Like I say, I'll put all the grass and the dry brush in really soon. Just have to get the main shapes in first. A few little tiny rocks here. I'm just using the very, very, very tip of my brush to put those in. And have some like here. There's a few darker lines just coming in over here. There we go. Now, clean out those brushes. And I want to do a little bit of dry brush. I'm getting my number 2 brush and some of the browny gray that I mixed up. I'd even put a little bit more burnt sienna with that. And I'm wiping it dry on my sponge so it's not too painty. And right here, wipe it a bit more. Right here, there's some like ripples and shadows that they're not really dark like the other ones. They're much lighter. So with that little bit of browny gray that's dry brush now, I'm just putting those in. And the same thing is happening here. I put a few of the darker shapes in, but there's some kind of ripples here and over here and here that are not, they're not harsh dark colors. They're much lighter. And now over here there's some sort of orangey brown reflections. I get a number 4 brush and mix some yellow and red with a little bit of that gray blue that I had. And again, I want dry brush. I want to really control this orangey color I'm going to put on. And I'm going to drag a little bit of it over here so that I get that sort of orangey brown reflection look that I see in the photograph. Because it's dry and because I have those bright yellow ones showing through, it won't be as bad as if I'd tried it wet and wet. If I tried it wet and wet, I've had a big mess there, which I don't want, really don't want. Now, there are also in the photograph some clouds reflecting, and I do want to just add a couple of those, and then I'm going to soften those in with a wet brush. Take a little bit of cadmium red on its own, which is too bright. Add a little bit of yellow to it. So I've just over the side, I've got some cadmium red and some yellow, and I'm just gonna add a little bit more in the too much water. So you have to be so careful. A little bit more in the way of streaks there, but I don't want to have too much because I think that's really going to overdo it. There we go. Just a little hint. I've just put a little bit of water, a little bit of red and yellow, just to add a few more reflections in there, like I see in the photograph. It's not totally necessary. You may have had that happen with your initial wash. I didn't have as much of that happening with my initial wash, so I'm going to put a bit more in. Now, I have my trusty little rigger brush. You can use that, or you can use a real tiny brush if you like. And I'm going to do some of the grass that's showing. So I'm going to mix. What I'm doing is I got a little bit of this browny color and a little bit of this blue mixture, and I'm rolling my rigger in those, making sure I don't have too much on there. And we'll test it. We'll flick. That's good. We'll flick upwards from this sort of muddy bank here. That's what it looks like anyway. Flick just very gently, flick those grasses up. It's going to add a nice dimension to this very, very horizontal picture, lots of horizontals, to have just a few of these vertical pieces of grass going up and down. It's just going to be enough to really, and there's some reflecting, make a difference to this picture. And also it looks, I can see like lots of little dots like this. I don't know what weeds they are, but they have lots of little seeds on them. And again, that adds some very pretty texture to these kind of foreground details. We can overdo it a little bit if we want to, have a few more than we actually see, some reflecting. I can definitely see the reflection of some of these, so I'll pull the reflections down. I can use this dry brush to put a few more little ripples in here. Now, what I do see in mine, in my photograph, is I see some ultramarine blue over here. I didn't want to put on in the original wash because I wasn't sure how that would mix, whether it mix and make green. So I've got some very, I'll put it over here. I have some very watery ultramarine blue on my number 4 brush. And I'm just going to, I'm going to dilute that even more. I can put more water with that. I'm just going to put a little bit of that blue shadow in here, just because this side of the painting is more in the evening shadow. And having that blue over the top of the pink looks way better than having it mixed with the pink in the original wash, because you see the pink glowing through. And literally, I'm going to show you again. This is how much blue I used, and this is how dilute it is. So don't be like getting a mix that looks like this, because that's not going to work. You need to have something that's almost just like your dirty water in your water pot here. Now, I think that is pretty much finished. If at any time you thought you had lost some of this highlight here, you can wait till it's dry and you can lift a little bit off, because most of the colors we've used are liftable. The only one that's not really liftable is the Phthalo Blue, and I didn't use too much of that. I made sure that I stuck to the ultramarine blue mixes so that you could, if you wanted, lift things off. And I'll demonstrate that. I think I have a couple of lifting brushes. Let me check out where they are. Here's one of them. So for lifting, you need super clean water, which I need to get. Very dry paper, super clean water. It helps if you have a special lifting brush. I have 2, a little tiny one. This one's called an eradicator. And they're short bristled. They're quite strong bristles, but not scratchy. You don't want to scratch your watercolor paper. You need dry paint. You need a Kleenex for dabbing and clean water. And if I go side to side here and dab, and side to side and dab, if I had lost some of those highlights, I would be able to get some back by doing that with this little brush. It's worth getting one of these little brushes. They're really useful, and it's great to be able to lift paint. I'm going to go back to our one that we did. These ones where I was showing you the first one, how I could lift it off. And I'll demonstrate on this one. This is perfectly dry now, and I have this little lifting eradicator brush. And supposing this was something like a tree or something I want to get some highlights, or a rock, look how well that's going to lift that paint. And if you have a nice sharp tip to it, you can get a nice sharp line. Now this one's ultramarine blue, phthalo blue, cadmium red, and permanent rose. So it might still lift because, yeah, it has the other liftable colors. The phthalo blue has not got so strong in this that you can't lift it. This is lovely if you're doing rocks and you want to put some, some stripes on the rocks that are really hard to put in there with. Supposing this was a little pebble and you wanted some little veins and things in that pebble, but you don't want to fiddle with masking fluid. It's too hard. Lifting out afterwards with a nice little lifting brush is wonderful. Ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, you're always going to be able to lift that. They're highly liftable. You can almost get pure white from lifting those, and lovely soft edges too. This was a rock, and I wanted to get a lovely soft edge. Use my lifting brush, a little bit of dabbing, not so much lifting here, so I get that nice transition. And a really sharp edge here, clean water, sharp edge. Look what you could do for building a rock. Let's zoom in even more. If this was a rock on the side of the ocean, and you want to lift that paint out afterwards rather than fiddle about trying to get it to look like a rock in the beginning. I'll do that again with this one here, where I just added more burnt sienna. Let's have a rock going in the opposite direction. I actually really like lifting when you're doing rocks. It's a great method, as long as you use the right colors. A little bit of lifting and dabbing, and you'll have some beautiful rocks. So let's zoom out. And the last step, I'm quite happy with my painting. It's finished. I'm going to take my tape off. And I use green tape from Dollarama because I go through rolls and rolls and rolls of it in my demonstrations so much. And it's just affordable, and it works well on cotton paper. But if you're a purist, you prefer having a good watercolor painter's tape, and you prefer to use a neutral color so it doesn't affect your color choices. And that, I understand that. I just don't have the budget for that. And I find the green tape from Dollarama works perfectly well for me and for what I'm trying to achieve. There we go. That's our finished painting for today. There's our reference photo. And just for a comparison with the paper, this is my Arche 140 pound cotton cold pressed paper. And this is the one that I just bought, which is, let's have a look, I've forgotten what, Fabriano, just a Fabriano student paper, which I think $5.95 for 30 sheets was really good. And if you're out painting outdoors, lovely to have this pad all, it's got a nice gummed edge to it and very handy to take along. But you definitely get better wet in wet effects with the Arche or a cotton paper kind. So thanks for painting along with me today, and I hope you enjoyed doing your Chile desert. Another big thank you to Daphne for the gorgeous photo. I hope you take some more, Daphne, or maybe you'll send me a few more gorgeous photos for painting. Bye now. Well, thank you for joining me for today's lesson. I hope your lovely sunset in the Chilean desert turned out beautifully, and you mixed some great darks, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for joining me.